Welcome to the Live for Eternity podcast. Physical health requires daily work and disciplines. Spiritual health requires daily work and disciplines. Hey, welcome to this week's show. I'm your host, BJ Herndon. Just first of all, I want to say thank you for joining me this week. If you are like me, I know several people that listen to this live here in Arkansas in the Deep South, and it has been a crazy week. We got snow the beginning of last week, which here in the South we don't get snow very often, and so we don't do very well in the snow. But it came anyway, and I mean, in my town we probably got 3 inches of snow, but it shut down everything for the whole week basically. No school for the whole week. Working remotely, that sort of thing. So that was interesting. Fitness-wise, I was still able to get in some running miles. I'm back healed up from the last leg injury that I had, and so I'm back out there building fitness, trying to increase my mileage. And so I was able to get outdoors. I guess 3 times. One time I went on my parents' treadmill. I don't know when the last time that thing was used. But I did a 4 or something mile run on it. But yeah, it's been a good week of building fitness. Got my workouts in. I told y'all at the end of last year about the plan that I have for strength training and running less miles this year. And so far I'm sticking to that. And I don't know that I've ever felt stronger overall than I do right now, which is the goal. My goal isn't, to look a certain way or anything like that, but I want to be more injury resistant and just have a stronger, healthier body just for the rest of my life, as much as I can control. And so been sticking to that pretty well. I did learn last week running in the snow is pretty nice. However, ice is bad. I never slipped and fell or anything, but towards the end of the week, especially when the snow was starting to melt, but then it'd refreeze overnight, that was when the runs got tricky and you really had to pay attention. Couldn't check out mentally. You had to stay focused the whole time, or else the ice could creep up there and get you. But made it through, and now we have freezing rain. I don't know that it's actually freezing for us right now, but it is raining outside as I speak. But anyways, that's just life, and there's gonna rarely have perfect weather and perfect opportunities and scenarios for getting your training in and sticking to your goals. Life's always gonna throw you curveballs, but that's why we work so hard for all this, is so that we can be ready for that and overcome whatever challenges come our way. So today I've got what I feel like is an interesting topic. Actually, if I didn't feel like this was an interesting topic, it probably wouldn't be worth my time myself recording this. But anyways, it's something that I've thought about for a while now, and to kind of set it up, I need to back up and just kind of show you where I'm coming from with all this. And so I'm going to do basically a quick run through of my job resume to show you how I've got to the point that I'm at right now. And so let me just say, for one, whenever I get a job, I stick to it for a while. So I haven't worked a whole lot of different places, but I have had a fairly interesting job resume. So my very first job was working at a gas station right across the road from my house in the town I grew up in. It was called Moose's Country Store, named after the owner. His name was Moose. I don't know if that was his real name or a nickname, but that's what everybody has always called him. So it was Moose's. So I worked there in the evenings for a little while I was in high school. And after probably just a few weeks of working there, baseball season started up. And mentioned on here before, I really wasn't athletic, and I didn't do anything athletic when I was in high school. Although I was on the baseball team for a while, it just didn't require a whole lot of physical activity or effort. Some of the guys really got into it, and they would strength train a lot and spend a lot of time in the gym and all that. But I was not that was always optional. I was not one of those guys that just decided to do that. And so I was on the team. I just didn't ever really get to play because of that. So when baseball season was about to start up, I learned, of course, baseball practices happen right after school in the afternoon into the evening. And that was when I worked. And so I remember walking up to the owner's wife, who was basically my boss. There was one day while I was at work, and I told her that I had quit because of baseball and asked what I was supposed to do. That's my first job, my first time to quit a job. So I was like, what do I do? Do I just quit? Like, do I just tell you bye? Or do I put in a 2 weeks notice? And she said, well, it'd be nice if you put in a 2 weeks notice. And I said, well, baseball practice starts next week. So unfortunately, I can't do that. So this will be my last night working for you. So probably didn't handle that the rest the right way, but it happened and it wasn't terrible. I think I might have got in a 2 days notice. So after that time, after high school, my next job was working for a fire extinguisher company. I told you this was unique, and so for this business, we went all over Central Arkansas. We inspected and serviced fire extinguishers in businesses and schools all over the state. And so I would work with local firemen from the Air Force Base. Their schedule for the air base, they were scheduled to work every other day. And so on their days off, that were the weekdays, they would work for this fire extinguisher company, just making a little bit extra money on the side. And so whenever they were there at the shop with me, that's when we would all ride together. We would go out to different businesses or whatever, and we would check their fire extinguishers. If any of them had been used or if any of them were out of service and needed to be just refilled and cleaned and all that, we would take them with us. And then the next day, I would be there at the shop by myself, and then I would fix the fire extinguishers, get them all up to code, ready to go. Then the day after that, we'd load them up, take them back, put them all where they go, bill the company, and then we'd go to the next place and check theirs. And so at that time, I was in a Christian rock band. We don't have to get into that a lot right now. So when I was riding with these guys, we would frequently talk about the band and different shows we were playing, or we sometimes talk about church. So let me just say, none of them went to church. So whenever we would start talking about it, their input was normally about why they didn't go to church. We'd start talking about it, the excuses would start rolling in. And since these guys, they were older, they were the ones driving the trucks, they were the ones that got to set the radio every day. That's pretty much an unwritten rule. So they would set what the music was on there. So depending on who I was with for the day, I would either listen to classic rock or hard rock, depending on whoever was driving and what their mood was. I could tell that they respected my beliefs, but they weren't going to change anything on my behalf. And also, these guys were in their 30s to 40s. I think one of the guys was even in his 50s. And I was like an 18-year-old kid. So, it wasn't like I was somebody that they necessarily look up to and respected, although they did respect that I stuck to my beliefs. But at that point, I'd lived a pretty sheltered life. We grew up in a small town. Church was basically my life, or high school band. And so, there just wasn't a lot of negative influences that I could have been exposed to really by that point. And so these guys weren't necessarily bad influences on me, but that season of life definitely opened my eyes to what the world was like. And so there were new things that I had never been exposed to before that these guys kind of exposed me to. So, and I'm not saying terrible things, but for instance, occasionally at the end of the day, when all of us that were working would end up at the shop together at the same time, the owner of the business, he was a good guy, but this is just part of their culture. He would, at the end of the day, long, hard day of work, he would bring a case of beer and just pass out cans of beer to everyone that wanted one. So, of course, I was under the legal drinking age at that time. Nobody even offered me one, and not that I would have taken it anyway. But, the next day after that, when I was at the shop by myself working, all the leftover cans of beer that they didn't open were just in the work refrigerator. And so if I ever wanted to drink one of them, it would have been right there. And so up to that point, I'd never even had that temptation before. Like if I wanted to get any beer or any kind of alcohol or whatever, drugs, anything, I wouldn't have even known where to go or how to get a hold of anything like that. And so it opened my eyes to what could have been a temptation that I had never had before, So a couple years after that, I was going to a local college, and then I transferred to a school an hour away. So I had to change jobs. I applied everywhere and ended up getting a job, of all places, at Walmart. And actually, that was a really good job for me. Retail can be tough, but I really enjoyed working there, and I tried my best to make the most of it. And so during that time, I made some great friends. We had some great times through the years. I started off that temporary career as a garden center cashier. Then I moved to sporting goods as a sales associate, then became department manager over automotive, and then finally ended up as the department manager over the garden center. So I worked there at Walmart for a little over 5 years. And again, it was a worldly job, even though the employees kept everything fairly professional. I mean, there wasn't anything wrong they were doing at work. They might not have had the best language. They might not have had the best stories from the weekend to tell, but they kept everything fairly professional while they were at work. And at Walmart, nothing was really special or sacred. And what I mean by that is, for instance, Sunday was just another work day to them. And actually, the reason that I never accepted a position higher than department manager is because if I did, they would have complete control of my schedule and I'd have to work on Saturdays and Sundays. And that wasn't something that I was willing to budge on. Plus, at that time, I was leading worship at church, so working at Walmart on Sundays wasn't an option for me. So after working there 5.5 years, while I was still working there, our church that I was at the time went through some transitions. The senior pastor retired, the youth pastor became the senior pastor there, and then he asked me to join the staff full-time as the youth pastor and to keep leading worship. He knew that there was a call in my life to be in ministry like that, and I had been plugged in and connected to the church ever since it was started, and so it just seemed like a good fit, and it also seemed to me like God was opening a door, and so I accepted that position and quit working at Walmart. I did put in a full 2 weeks notice at that time. And so I worked there at the church full-time for almost 10 years as a youth pastor and a worship leader. And then that was when I sensed God telling me it was time for another transition to move into something else. And so now at this point, life is different than the time of working in full-time ministry. My job, it's completely secular. Currently, I work for the state as part of DHS, leading their fatherhood program for the state. And so I work for the government, which requires there to be somewhat of a separation between my faith and my work. Now, the job that I do, it's a rewarding job. And fortunately, everyone that I work with believes in God and they're really good about living out their faith. But there's still limits about how much we can let our faith influence our work. I still attend a church faithfully. I'm even in a volunteer ministry position helping lead worship at their young adult service. But I'm not required to attend every church service. I'm not required to pay tithes to the church. I have more free time with my family, and I can pick and choose when and how we volunteer in ministry. And I'm probably in a similar position to the majority of people that listen to this podcast. And in many ways, you could say that things now are the opposite of how it was in full-time ministry. So instead of being paid to tell people about Jesus, there are many that would say a large part of my government job is not to talk about Jesus or to share any part of my faith while at work. And instead of standing in front of a large group of church members to lead them, I'm part of the congregation when I go to church, and I'm there to follow whoever is leading that service. It's a completely different mindset when you go to church as a volunteer as opposed to going there as an employee working for the church. Or is it? And I guess a better question would be, should it be? Should there be a difference between how a full-time minister lives their lives and how we live ours? And that's what I want to talk about today, is the difference between the secular and the sacred, the worldly parts of our lives and then the church part of our lives. And so I get that there are some obvious differences. I'm not saying that we should all be able to preach a sermon as eloquently as your pastor can. I'm not saying that the church should pay your salary or that you should carry the weight and the responsibility of every person that goes to your church on your shoulders. There is a unique calling that pastors have. But there may not be as big of a difference between how they live their lives and how we should be living ours. With the mix of secular and ministry jobs that I've worked, I've been able to see how the two worlds are different and yet similar at the same time. So for most of us, we tend to separate the two. I'm not saying that we're two completely different people at church or at work, but mentally, there tends to be this separation between what happens at church and what happens at work or home. And so, first of all, I want to talk about what happens in the church world, especially when it's your job. So, when I was in full-time ministry, there was an obvious need for dependence on God. And I think you would all agree with this. Spending time with God daily was essential if I was going to be able to hear God's voice and to help lead people to God's will. So if I neglected that relationship, or if I failed to listen for God's voice, it became apparent when I tried to lead people into God's presence. So in my mind, having that daily time with God was just a basic requirement for any minister. And I don't think any of you would disagree with that. There's an expectation that the ministers that we follow have a close relationship with God. We hope and we generally assume that they're spending time with God every day and they're seeking His direction, to lead the church or the ministry. And you usually follow your pastor because you believe there's someone that's farther along in their spiritual journey than you are. And we tend to see them as people of great faith and consistency and integrity. So when that was my full-time job, I got that. To me, that just kind of came with the territory. I knew that people were counting on me to stay close to God. I knew that people were watching my every move and they were following my example. I felt the pressure of needing to do everything right and to speak on behalf of God to His people. And that was a huge responsibility, but it's what God told me to do, and it's what I agreed to do. So looking back over my almost 10 years in full-time ministry, I can honestly say that I did my best to live that kind of life. I did spend time with God literally every day. I did my best to live a life of integrity, both inside and outside of church. My goal was to be like the Apostle Paul whenever he said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." And I genuinely believe that if people followed me, they followed my example, then I would lead them to Christ through my words and my actions. The only regrets that I have during that season of life are the risks that I didn't take. A lot of times I stayed within the imaginary lines that people wanted me to stay in. But I think I could have made an even greater impact if I had pushed those boundaries even more. So that season of life in full-time ministry showed me that there is a need to work for both spiritual gain and for what you could consider to be worldly gain. When I left my full-time ministry position, one of my goals was to raise awareness of the need for ministers to take care of their bodies for the sake of making a greater ministry impact. So there was this joke in the church that pastors only work 2 hours per week, meaning that was whenever they were speaking on Sunday mornings. Now, there may be little truth to that if you're only a preacher, although I know from experience that it takes way more than 2 hours per week to just write a sermon. But the calling to pastor a congregation is not to just be a public speaker once a week. That means that they're available to make hospital calls at all hours of the day or night. They help people in need all throughout the week. They serve people in their church in all kinds of ways, whether it's doing physical labor or listening to their problems or offering wise counsel. And in many of those examples, you can see where there's an opportunity to physically show the love of Christ to people in need. And it only makes sense that the more they're physically able to do, the more they can serve their congregation. The message of hope that pastors are called to share is worth sharing with passion and energy and enthusiasm. Now, that doesn't mean that God can't use ministers that are sick or that are elderly, but there is validity to the point that almost every minister can improve their ministry effectiveness by taking care of their body physically. The more you're physically able to do, the more you can serve. And even though the role of a minister or pastor is one that's largely spiritual, we can still see a huge benefit of making physical disciplines a part of their daily routine. And this is something that isn't just true in theory, but I've personally seen it work. I've been at a place in ministry where I lacked the drive to do more than what was required. And what awakened my soul was learning how to take care of my body. Pushing myself physically opened my eyes to begin to dream bigger dreams for both myself and my family and my ministry. Serving became exciting again because it was an opportunity to put into practice what I had been improving on. And I'm not the only example of that. Some of the most influential pastors in America today share that the reason they've been able to lead such great ministries is because they took a step of faith, they depended on God, and they learned to train their bodies to increase their energy and their physical ability. So now, let's look at you. The average listener of this podcast is someone that believes in God and attends a church, but they probably work at a secular job, meaning they don't work for a church. You probably belong to a family, and I know that many of you have children of your own. You probably don't feel called to be in full-time ministry, but you want to make an eternal impact. And if you follow along for very long, you hopefully see the value in taking care of your body by developing healthy habits with diet and exercise. You probably don't see yourself as a minister and may not see yourself as any kind of a leader. So what could there be to gain from looking at how your life compares to someone in full-time ministry? Well, actually, a lot. You may not be called to lead a congregation, but you are a leader. Every one of you. People are watching how you live your life and will follow your example. If you're a supervisor at work, or if you're a teacher, there's people that are watching your every move. If you have coworkers that know you're a follower of Christ, they're looking to your example. If you're on social media, you have followers. Well, that's the title given to them by the social media platforms, but it's true. People are watching what you say and what you post. And most importantly, if you're a parent, you have a major leadership responsibility. In fact, a lot of the problems that I faced working with teenagers as a youth pastor were the results of parents leaving the spiritual work to the pastors. Their belief was that the church leadership was responsible for the spiritual outcome of their child. I always found that kind of funny since they would only spend a couple of hours with us each week at best, but they spent the majority of the rest of their time with their family and friends. I mean, how much influence could we possibly have on them? I would argue that the main responsibility of a parent is to pastor their children. You may not be able to control your child's individual decisions or even their eternal destination, but you are called to train them the right way by what you say and do. Solomon writes in Proverbs 22:6, "Train a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it." This verse gives us a promise that whenever we train our children the right way, they will eventually choose the right way. Now, it can be hard to trust this verse when you have a child that has wandered away from God. And in fact, I have some dear friends right now that we're still praying and believing this verse over them for their children to come back to Christ. But regardless of what they choose, we have the responsibility as parents to train them the right way by setting the right example. You're a leader, whether you realize it or not. And leaders never lead people the right way by accident. It takes discipline and focused work. And so if your pastor needs to spend time with God daily, then you do too. I mean, even Jesus spent time with God, his heavenly Father, every day. And here's why. You'll never get in shape if you only work out one day per week. You get that. There's no way that you could do enough in one day to counter not doing anything for your health the remaining 6 days of the week. And in the same way, you'll never get spiritually strong if one day of church is all you're getting in each week to grow spiritually. Physical health requires daily work and disciplines. Spiritual health requires daily work and disciplines. Every day doesn't have to be the same. Your workouts through the week aren't the same thing each day. Instead, you vary the duration and the intensity. And even on a rest day, you don't completely neglect your health. You don't spend all day in bed eating as much junk food as you possibly can. Now, you may not get in an actual workout those days, and you may have a cheat meal, but once this becomes part of who you are, you continue to do more of the right thing. Spiritually speaking, it's basically the same way. Once your identity becomes a child of God, that should influence all other decisions that you make. Every day may not look exactly the same, but you never truly take a day off. Some days you'll be able to make time for more focused prayer and Bible study, just like with your more intense workouts. Other days, you'll only be able to get in a smaller amount, but you still do something to keep making progress. And then on the weekend, you can get in your spiritual long run, which would be like a Sunday church service where there's more time set aside for spiritual growth. There's no specific amount or type of spiritual discipline required to be called a child of God. After all, it's all about walking daily with God. It's more about the relationship than just sticking to a set of rules. At the end of the day, you don't stick to your workouts because you necessarily enjoy the suffering. You stick to it because you enjoy the journey and the outcomes. Now, I run because I like to run. I do the work of strength training because I know that it'll help me to be able to run more and for longer. There are days that spending time in prayer and the Bible feels like a workout I'm forcing myself to do. But even on those days, I do it anyway because I enjoy walking through life with God leading me. It's an adventure that I can't find anywhere else. I can't follow God if I don't work on being able to hear His voice. And even when it feels like work, you can still find a sense of enjoyment through it. Now, here's another lesson to be learned from pastors. Pastors have a certain expectation on them to be spiritual leaders in the community. We expect them to share their faith and to talk openly about their beliefs with anyone and everyone. In some ways, that makes it easier for them to share Jesus with others. If someone knows they're talking to a pastor, it's no surprise for them to talk about their church or to invite someone to their church. I had people in the past that completely changed their demeanor when I told them I was a pastor. They'd quit using foul language all of a sudden or stop making crude jokes just on the spot. And a lot of times, just out of the blue, people would start making excuses for why they don't go to church without me doing anything to lead the conversation that way. There's just that expectation that pastors always talk about church or God, and justifiably so. However, there was a big drawback that happened when people learned that I was a pastor. They acted like I was completely different from them. It was almost like whenever you hear out the speech from the solar panel salesman because you know that it's just their job. They're just doing their job. People respected the title, but most of the time they had no intention of really hearing what I had to say. Church was my thing and they had their own thing. But it's different when it's not your job, but you still share Jesus with others. That sends a message that it's real and that it's meaningful to you. You aren't being paid to talk about Jesus, but you choose to do so out of the overflow of all that He's done for you. People can tell when you share your faith from a place of enjoyment as opposed to obligation. In many ways, you're in a more effective position to lead someone to the Lord than your pastor. Now, your pastor may know more scripture or have the sinner's prayer memorized, but that doesn't necessarily equal souls saved if people aren't willing to give their life to the Lord. So that's why you have the opportunity to let them see Jesus in you. Now, there's an interesting concept Paul writes about in Ephesians chapter 4. He says, "So Christ Himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers to equip His people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ." That's Ephesians 4:11 through 13. So, according to these verses, the role of a pastor is to equip God's people for works of service. The spiritual responsibility falls on all of us. I do agree that pastors should lead the way in this, but they shouldn't be the ones doing all the work. People need to see Jesus at your workplace and in your home or school. And when we all take up that spiritual responsibility, that's how the entire church grows. Not just numerically, but also deeper in our faith and understanding of God. So to sum it up, no matter your role or your occupation, we can all benefit from removing the dividing line between the secular and the sacred. If your job is something that you see as fully spiritual, Don't neglect your physical disciplines. Doing so will only hinder your ministry effectiveness. If your job is secular, don't neglect spiritual disciplines. Realize that you have many of the same responsibilities as a pastor when it comes to leading your family and being a witness. You need the help of the Holy Spirit as much as anyone else. Your physical abilities can't save your own soul or anyone else's. 1 Timothy 4:8 says, "For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come." No matter who you are or what you do, when you make God the Lord of both this earthly life and the spiritual life to come, that's how you live for eternity. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode. I guess a lot of the reason behind the subject of this episode was because I've been able to see so many of these same principles in my own life. Whenever I was in ministry, so much of my focus was just on the spiritual things, which no doubt is super important when it's your job. But at the same time, whenever I started taking care of myself physically, that's when I saw so much growth in so many areas. And I thought, man, if I would have just got a hold of this concept earlier, my time in ministry could have been so much different. And in my opinion, so much more effective at making a greater impact. And then now that I'm not in full-time ministry, there's so many of the spiritual disciplines that I had in place just because I felt like it was my responsibility being a minister, that now I see the need for that every day anyway, just in the positions I'm in now. To be an effective witness at work, I need to stay close to God. To be a great leader as a parent and to lead my children the right way, they need to see me having that relationship with God. It doesn't need to be something that they only see happen at church. They need to see it lived out first and foremost at home with the people that are called to lead them. And so it's one of those, there's benefit to all of that. And the goal, I believe, for all of us is to not neglect any of those areas of life, to be physically fit as much as we can, but also to be spiritually fit and to have health and to be seeking health in both of those areas of life. It's not one or the other. God has given us the opportunity for both and so it's something that I feel like we should seek. And so just to wrap this up today, I know that there's so much that we could do physically, but a lot of the spiritual work, that's us depending on God. And so I just want to pray over each of you today as we wrap this up. God, I thank you for every one of these people that listen to this. I thank you for the work that you've done and that you are doing for your kingdom. I thank you for just the way that you've opened our eyes to be able to see the need for taking care of our bodies, but also our spirits and our souls, so that we can make the greatest impact for your kingdom. Lord, would you help us in areas where we're weak or where we struggle? I know that it can be difficult to start new good habits, in whether it is in our physical life or spiritual life. So Lord, help us to be able to do that. Help us to be committed. Even the days where it feels like work, help us to continue to do the work anyway, because we know that the payoff is worth it. God, just to be able to walk through life hand in hand with you, to be able to hear your voice, God, to be able to live out the adventure that is following you and walking with you. God, it's worth anything that feels like work to be able to get to that point. God, so help us to stay committed and trust that you'll let there be a payoff. You'll let there be a harvest whenever it is the right time. God, help us to just continue to lean on you even in a greater way. Whatever it is that you've called each of us individually to do, we can't accomplish all of that to the greatest level, to make the greatest impact without your help. So strengthen us and equip us to do all these things through your power and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you have a great rest of your week. We will see you next time on here with hopefully some more great content that will help you make the most of your physical and spiritual life, all for the glory of God, so that we can all live for eternity.